a golden afternoon in late June, the village of Muchwood-on-the-Hill found itself in festive spirits. The lawns of Hazelwood Rise, the estate belonging to retired concert pianist Mr. Lewis Hartington, were dressed in bunting and white parasols. Card tables were set up with floral tablecloths, and the air buzzed with gentle laughter, clinking teacups, and the muted strains of Chopin playing from a gramophone tucked beneath a yew hedge. It was the annual charity garden party, hosted by Mr. Hartington in aid of the St. Mildred's Restoration Fund. Muchwood was a place of genteel routine, of jam stalls and parish newsletters, but on this particular afternoon, the village had gathered in greater numbers than usual. Mr. Hartington, a man of delicate manners and polished shoes, had promised a short recital in the drawing-room following tea, a rare treat that had stirred no small excitement among the attendees. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in lavender and white lace, sipped her elderflower cordial in a corner chair, quite content to observe the bustle. She had come with her niece's encouragement, though she hardly needed persuasion. Miss Marple had a natural fondness for such events, not for the entertainment itself, but for the peculiar patterns of human nature that always emerged when people gathered under the guise of festivity. Young Mrs. Clara Goodwin, wife of the local solicitor, fussed at the cake table, casting furtive glances at her husband and whispering sharply to her sister. Colonel Denby, a bluff and slightly deaf widower, monopolized the jam judging. Reverend Mark Pritchard chatted with the banker's daughter in what he clearly believed to be a casual, pastoral fashion, but which Miss Marple instantly recognized as something more hopeful. Mr. Hartington himself, his silver hair gleaming like polished pewter, stood with a fluted glass in hand, the center of a modest circle that included Dr. Nathan Bryce, the village's quietly cynical physician. At precisely 4 o'clock, a delicate chime sounded from the veranda bell, and the guests were ushered indoors to the drawing-room. The recital was charming, though brief, Debussy mostly, and a final Chopin nocturne that sent a shiver down several spines. Mr. Hartington bowed modestly, his fingers still light with music. As the last notes faded, the applause was interrupted by a scream. It came from the conservatory. There was a brief, frozen silence, the sort of silence that falls not out of respect, but out of sheer bewilderment. And then the scramble began. Reverend Pritchard knocked over a footstool in his haste. Mrs. Goodwin dropped her teacup. Miss Marple rose slowly, with the calmness of someone who has seen too many such sudden ends in too many ordinary places. The crowd pressed toward the conservatory. It was Mrs. Ellis, the cook's cousin visiting from Eastbourne, who had screamed. She now stood at the far side of the tiled floor, her hand clutched to her mouth, pointing with a shaking finger at what lay crumpled by the piano stool. Mr. Hartington's housekeeper, Miss Isabel Green, lay quite still on the floor, her face turned at an unnatural angle. The room, filled with the scent of orchids and the last echo of the Chopin nocturne, felt as though the music had imprinted itself on the air like a ghost. "Is she?" someone whispered. "She's dead," said Dr. Bryce after a quick examination. "Neck broken, sudden, instantaneous." "A fall?" asked Mr. Hartington, his voice hoarse. "No," said Dr. Bryce, his tone grim. "Not a fall. She was struck." Miss Marple, standing unobtrusively behind the taller guests, adjusted her gloves and narrowed her eyes. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned pots or broken glass, nothing to suggest panic or pursuit, only the soft tick of the wall, clock, and the music, Chopin, that had continued to play, gently, after the murder. She turned slightly, looking not at the body, but at the expressions of those around her. The faces betrayed varying degrees of horror, confusion, and in a few rare cases, something else altogether: calculation, fear, concealment. It was a dreadful thing, Miss Green's death, but dreadful things often revealed the truth beneath, well-tended surfaces. And Miss Marple, who had never learned to play piano but had spent a lifetime reading people like sheet music, felt the first whisper of something. Off, quite off, and very interesting indeed. The scene at Hazelwood Rise had unravelled like silk catching on a thorn. The garden party had dissolved into chaos, parasols abandoned and teacups forgotten as the guests gathered uneasily within the drawing room. The music had long since stopped, but its lingering memory gave the air an eerie resonance, as if the keys had mourned the death before anyone else noticed. Dr. Bryce crouched beside the lifeless form of Miss Isabel Green, his brow furrowed. He was a man not easily rattled, accustomed as he was to the small ailments and occasional tragedies of village life. But something in the manner of the housekeeper's death had unsettled even him. The angle of the neck, the stillness of the limbs. It was no natural collapse. Miss Marple stood quietly near the doorframe, a small figure half obscured by the broad silhouette of Reverend Pritchard, who had taken to murmuring prayers under his breath. She made no move to step forward, nor did she interrupt the hubbub of exclamations or the questions being hurled at Dr. Bryce. Instead, her pale blue eyes moved slowly across the conservatory. The body lay in a neat heap just behind the grand piano beside the green velvet piano stool. The room had not been disturbed otherwise. The potted ferns stood upright, and a crystal vase filled with sweet peas sat unsmashed on the windowsill. If not for the unnatural angle of Miss Green's head, the scene might have passed for someone simply fainting from the heat. It was Mr. Hartington who spoke first with clarity, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "I'd like the house cleared," he said. "Everyone, please, back into the garden or the front rooms. The police must be called. No one is to leave." There was a ripple of discomfort, and a few guests began to protest weakly, but Mr. Hartington raised a trembling but authoritative hand. "Please, this is now a matter for the authorities." Miss Marple allowed herself to be shepherded back into the drawing-room with the rest, though she paused on the threshold and glanced once more at the piano stool, then at the music stand. The sheet music had been left open, Chopin's Nocturne, in E minor. The final piece played before the scream, the last notes, the last sound before silence fell. As the guests spilled out in murmuring confusion, the door to the conservatory was firmly closed behind them. Dr. Bryce remained with the body. Mr. Hartington stood at the hearth, speaking in low tones to Clara Goodwin's husband, Richard, who had taken it upon himself to telephone the local constabulary. It was Clara who drifted toward Miss Marple, her face pinched with worry. "Dreadful business," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I can hardly believe it. Poor Miss Green. She's been with Mr. Hartington since he moved here, 5 years nearly. Quiet woman, stern but proper." "Yes," murmured Miss Marple. "I believe she trained under the late Mrs. Fairbanks at the Elms in Woking. That would explain the starch in her collars. An efficient housekeeper is not always a beloved one, I've found." Clara hesitated. Do you really think she was murdered?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Well, Dr. Bryce seemed quite certain. It was no accident, and accidents do not usually strike so cleanly at the base of the skull, dear, nor do they select such moments of convenience. That piece of music must have been halfway through." Clara shivered slightly. "But who could have done such a thing, in the middle of the party?" "There are always eyes that go unseen," said Miss Marple gently, "even in crowded rooms, especially then." At that moment, the front door swung open, and in strode Inspector Felix Cray, a tall man with sandy hair and a weathered trench coat he wore regardless of weather. He had the cautious, appraising manner of a man used to pulling apart lies threaded with politeness. Though Miss Marple had encountered him only once before, he remembered her well enough. His eyes flicked over the room and settled briefly on Her before moving on to Mr. Hartington. Dr. Bryce has informed me the body remains in situ? He asked. Yes, in the conservatory, said Mr. Hartington. His voice, though firm, carried the tightness of grief. I haven't touched anything. No one has. Good, said Cray. I'll need a list of all guests and staff present. No one leaves without speaking to me or my men. Sergeant Lowe will take down statements. He turned and gave a short nod to Miss Marple. Miss Marple, I don't suppose you were playing sleuth already? Oh, no, said Miss Marple, her voice as mild as milk. Merely observing. One learns much that way. Cray didn't smile, but there was a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth. So I've heard. While Sergeant Lowe began interviewing the more vocal guests, Reverend Pritchard, Mrs. Ellis, and the flustered Mrs. Goodwin, Cray returned to the conservatory to examine the scene himself. Miss Marple, now seated with her hands folded on her lap, listened as the babble of conversations resumed around her, lower and sharper now, with a tang of fear in every syllable. It was curious, she thought, how quickly tragedy turned people inward. Some grew louder in the face of it, puffing up with authority or righteousness, while others shrank back, as if their very souls had become smaller. She had seen it during the war, and again during the scandal of the Garden Club embezzlement in St. Mary Mead. People showed who they truly were, not during peace, but when peace was disturbed. She listened as Mrs. Ellis told the same story for the third time. How she'd gone into the conservatory looking for lemonade. How she'd tripped on the corner of the rug, how she'd seen the body and screamed. Yet Miss Marple found herself noting that Mrs. Ellis was not wearing shoes meant for tripping, sensible flat heels, and that the corner of the rug was, from what she recalled, quite secure. And why lemonade? It had been set in pictures on the veranda. No need to search for it. Clara was now whispering with her sister near the sideboard. Colonel Denby had stationed himself near the decanters, muttering darkly about foreigners and communists and what the world's come to. The banker's daughter, Judith Prentice, was pale and unusually silent, seated apart with her hands clenched in her lap. She had arrived only 2 months ago from London and was still regarded with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Miss Marple turned her attention to Mr. Hartington. He had moved to the window and stood stiffly, his face a study in self-control. When questioned by the inspector earlier, he had spoken little of Miss Green beyond her years of service and diligence. He had not appeared especially shaken, but that was not uncommon in people of his generation and artistic discipline. Still, there had been a flicker, just a flicker, of something in his eyes when Cray mentioned that Miss Green had been struck from behind. Miss Marple considered. A housekeeper, dead. A blow behind the head, perfectly timed between 2 movements of music. A scream that no one heard until the last note. And still the most intriguing thing, she thought, was not who killed Miss Green, but why. There were no jewels stolen, no sign of forced entry, no broken china or bloodied candlesticks. Only a woman who had spent years in silent, orderly service, now lying still as stone on a conservatory floor. And the music had played on. The evening deepened its slow descent into a lingering haze of uncertainty. The golden glow of late June. Sunlight faded through the conservatory's tall glass panes, casting long shadows that crept across the polished floor. Inside the drawing room, the atmosphere was thick with whispered conversations and guarded glances. The guests, now prisoners of circumstance and suspicion, exchanged fragmented theories and nervous conjectures, none of which satisfied the keen scrutiny of Miss Marple. Inspector Felix Cray had settled into a methodical rhythm, questioning each attendee in turn while his sergeant took notes with clinical precision. Despite the veneer of officialdom, the small group resembled a parlour scene from one of Mr. Hartington's old scores, composed faces masking disquiet, movements measured, words chosen carefully. Miss Marple, seated by the window with a lace handkerchief neatly folded in her lap, observed it all with the quiet patience of a gardener watching the slow reveal of buds. The first to be questioned was Reverend Mark Pritchard, who seemed eager to assist, but repeatedly fell back on platitudes and prayers when pressed for specifics. His bright eyes, however, betrayed a flicker of unease. He confessed that he had noticed Miss Green appearing distracted earlier in the afternoon, though he could not say why. She seemed burdened, as if carrying a weight too heavy for a housekeeper, he admitted with a sigh. But I thought it was just the heat. Miss Marple made a subtle note of this. The idea of a secret burden was a familiar tune in the symphony of village life. Clara Goodwin, whose voice had grown more tremulous with each retelling, insisted that everyone had been amicable, with no hint of ill will or quarrel. Her insistence was less convincing with each repetition, and Miss Marple caught the quick glance she shot at her husband when the inspector questioned him about his whereabouts during the recital. Richard Goodwin had been pacing by the window, his expression tight and guarded. "I was outside taking a call about a business matter," he said, somewhat defensively. Mrs. Ellis, still visibly shaken, repeated her story once more, but this time Miss Marple noticed a detail missed before. The cook's cousin had mentioned seeing Miss Green near the piano moments before the music began. "She was adjusting the stool, I think," Mrs. Ellis said. "The chair was a bit wobbly." "A wobbly stool," Miss Marple murmured to herself, the corner of her mouth lifting in a slight smile. She had no doubt this would prove a significant detail later. Colonel Denby was next, his gruff voice laced with impatience. He dismissed the notion of murder outright, blaming the modern age and its perils. Yet under Cray's persistent questioning, he admitted to having had a brief but heated argument with Miss Green the week before over some missing silver spoons. "She was always so strict about the house rules," he grumbled. "A tough woman, but fair enough. I suppose she was not popular with everyone." That comment piqued Miss Marple's interest. The possibility of a grudge simmered beneath the surface. Judith Prentice, the banker's daughter, was last. Her pale face had grown paler still as she described her arrival in the village and how she had yet to feel at home among the tight-knit community. "I did not know Miss Green well," she said quietly, "but I noticed how she watched me, as if she were measuring me against some invisible scale." Miss Marple felt a flicker of sympathy for the newcomer. To be scrutinized in a place where everyone knew each other's history was to carry a burden few outsiders understood. As the questioning continued, Miss Marple's mind traced invisible lines connecting the pieces of this delicate puzzle. She reflected on the housekeeper's position, a woman entrusted with secrets, a guardian of propriety, yet herself isolated in the household hierarchy. Miss Green was not simply a servant. She was the silent sentinel of the household's dignity, and perhaps unwittingly, its buried scandals. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Sergeant Lowe entered, holding a small envelope addressed to Mr. Hartington. The inspector took it with a raised brow and carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of typed paper, an anonymous note. The message was brief but chilling. "The music hides what the eye cannot see. Listen closely, and you will understand." A hush fell over the room as the note was read aloud. Eyes flickered toward the piano, as if it might suddenly yield its secrets. Mr. Hartington's hand trembled as he folded the note. "This is peculiar," he said. "I cannot think who would send such a message." Miss Marple's gaze did not waver from the piano. "Messages like this," she said softly, "are seldom about the music itself. They speak in riddles to mask the truth." Cray frowned, turning the paper over. "Could be a prank, or someone trying to unsettle us." "Or," said Miss Marple, "someone drawing attention to a detail deliberately overlooked." She rose and moved toward the piano, her steps measured and careful. The polished wood gleamed in the dimming light. She ran a finger gently along the edge of the keys, then glanced toward the music stand. The sheet music remained open to the Chopin Nocturne. Yet something was different now. The bottom edge of the page was faintly crumpled, as if someone had hastily brushed it with their fingers or perhaps attempted to conceal a note tucked beneath. "May I?" she asked Mr. Hartington, who nodded. With delicate fingers, Miss Marple lifted the page. Beneath it, pressed flat against the music stand, was a small scrap of paper, yellowed with age. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a handwritten message. "Beware." The silence after the last note. A chill passed through the room. The phrase echoed in the silence like a warning. Someone knew Miss Green's death would be timed with the music, Miss Marple said quietly. This was no spontaneous act. Who would benefit from such a precise and cruel arrangement? Asked Cray. "That is what we must discover," she replied. The inspector's gaze shifted to Mr. Hartington. "Do you have enemies, Mr. Hartington? Anyone who might wish you ill?" The pianist's face darkened. "In the musical world, competition can breed bitterness. But here, in Muchwood, no one, I think. This is my sanctuary." Miss Marple, however, was not so sure. Her eyes flicked toward the gathering crowd visible through the drawing-room windows. A village, no matter how tranquil, harbored its secrets. Old grievances and jealousies, long buried, often erupted in the least expected ways. She turned back to the group now assembled. "I suspect," she said softly, "that the music was more than background. It was a signal." "A signal?" Cray echoed. "Yes. The killer chose that precise moment, knowing the music would mask the sound of the blow. They relied on the distraction it created, the deafening quiet that follows a performance." "An audacious plan," Cray murmured. Miss Marple nodded, "and one that suggests intimate knowledge of both the house and Miss Green's routines." "Then the murderer is one of us," Mr. Hartington said bitterly. "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, "but not necessarily the most obvious." She glanced again at the group, noting the subtle changes in posture, the quickened breaths, the darting eyes. The true story was hidden in these unspoken details, the weight of a glance, the hesitation in a word. Her thoughts returned to the piano stool, the supposedly wobbly chair. If it had been deliberately loosened, it might have been a ruse, a distraction, or perhaps a key element in the killer's plan. As evening drew in, Miss Marple knew this was only the beginning. The music that played after the murder was not just a haunting melody, it was a puzzle waiting to be solved, and she intended to listen carefully. The dimming light cast a soft glow on the faces assembled in the drawing room, where tension now thickened the air like an unwelcome fog. Miss Marple's calm demeanor belied the swift movements of her mind, piecing together what seemed to be disparate threads into a coherent fabric. The discovery of the cryptic note beneath the Chopin nocturne and the thought of the wobbly piano stool had unsettled the room, though none dared to voice their fears aloud. Inspector Cray, ever the pragmatist, was quick to assert control. "We shall need to inspect the piano more thoroughly," he declared, "and examine the house itself for anything suspicious. Miss Marple, if you would care to accompany me, Hercule," nodded, masking the keen spark of anticipation in her eyes. The opportunity to investigate was precisely what she needed to uncover subtleties others might overlook. They approached the grand piano with deliberate care. The polished surface reflected the glow of a solitary table lamp, and the stool indeed wobbled slightly when nudged. Cray tested it with his weight, noting the instability. "Quite the hazard," he remarked dryly, "though I doubt it was an accident." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the stool's legs. One had a faint smear of dirt, inconsistent with the otherwise pristine cleanliness of the drawing room. "This leg appears to have been disturbed recently," she said softly. "And notice how the underside shows faint scratches, as if someone tried to prop it unevenly." Cray bent down, inspecting carefully. "Perhaps someone arranged this to cause a fall. Miss Green would have been seated here for the recital." A fall from this height might not be fatal, but it could incapacitate. Or, Miss Marple mused, it could have been intended to distract or delay her, creating a vulnerable moment. The inspector nodded thoughtfully, then turned his attention to the piano keys. "Is there any sign of forced entry or tampering here?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, the piano itself seems untouched, aside from the stool and that hidden note." She pointed to the scrap beneath the music sheet. This message was carefully concealed, but not well enough to avoid discovery. Whoever left it wanted it. Found. Just not too soon. Cray frowned. A taunt, perhaps. Or a warning. Their conversation was interrupted by the return of Sergeant Lowe, who entered with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "We found this in the gardener's shed," he announced. "It was addressed to Miss Green." Miss Marple took the parcel with a steady hand and carefully unwrapped it. Inside lay a faded photograph of a younger Miss Green standing alongside a man whose face was obscured by a fold in the paper. On the back, a date and a cryptic note were scrawled in an elegant hand. "The past returns with the music." The room seemed to grow colder as Miss Marple held the photograph. "This is more than a simple murder," she said quietly. "It's tied to a history someone wishes to bury." Inspector Cray looked up sharply. "Who could have sent this? And why now?" "That is the question," she replied. "Miss Green must have been involved in something beyond her role as housekeeper. Perhaps she was privy to secrets better left undisturbed." The inspector gestured toward the gathered guests, still lingering in the adjacent room. "We should question them again now, with these new revelations in mind," Miss Marple agreed, and moved back to the drawing room, her eyes sweeping over each face. The atmosphere was tense, the veneer of polite conversation thinning under the weight of suspicion. She addressed the group gently. "It seems Miss Green's past may hold the key to this mystery. Does anyone know anything about her background that might be relevant?" There was a long silence before Clara Goodwin spoke hesitantly. "I have heard rumors," she said, glancing nervously at the others. "Before she came here, Miss Green worked in London. Something about a scandal. But no one ever spoke openly. Mrs. Ellis nodded. "Aye, and some said she was connected to a certain gentleman. Well, that's the talk, but I never paid it much mind." Judith Prentice's eyes darkened. "I believe the truth is more complicated than gossip. Miss Green was cautious. I saw her making discreet calls, sometimes late at night." Miss Marple noted the furtive glances exchanged between Richard Goodwin and his wife, as if some shared knowledge simmered beneath their calm exterior. The inspector pressed, "Was there anyone who might have wished her harm for what she knew or did?" Colonel Denby shrugged. "Hard to say, people carry grudges. But Miss Green was professional, if strict. I can't imagine anyone from this village would kill her. Yet someone did," Miss Marple said softly. "And I suspect that person is closer than we think." She turned toward the window, where the first stars began to twinkle. The phrase, "the music hides what the eye cannot see," lingers in my mind. It suggests the killer relied on distractions, on the veil of performance to mask their actions. Cray nodded thoughtfully. "The timing was too precise to be accidental." Miss Marple's gaze returned to the photograph in her hand. "The past returns with the music," she repeated. "Whoever sent this wanted to remind us that history is never truly silent." She paced slowly, then stopped, fixing her eyes on Richard Goodwin. "Mr. Goodwin, you mentioned taking a business call during the recital. May I ask, what was the nature of that call?" Richard's eyes flickered with something unreadable before he answered. "A client issue. Nothing related. To this house or Miss Green." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just slightly. "And yet your wife seemed to share a look with you when questioned earlier." Clara Goodwin's lips pressed into a thin line. "We have nothing to hide," she said quietly. But Miss Marple was not convinced. Human nature, she knew, was more revealing than words. The smallest gestures could betray the heaviest secrets. As the night deepened, the investigation settled into a rhythm of quiet observation. Miss Marple retreated to a corner, her mind weaving connections between the housekeeper's past, the anonymous notes, and the subtle tensions among the guests. She recalled the gardener's shed where the photograph had been found. Why there? She wondered aloud. Who had access? And why hide the photograph among tools and dirt? Suddenly an idea took shape. The key to the mystery may lie not only in what Miss Green knew, but in whom she trusted or feared. Her eyes drifted back to the piano, to the wobbly stool and the chilling notes left behind. Somewhere in the silence after the last note, the truth waited to be heard, and Miss Marple was listening carefully. The morning light filtered gently through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room as the village slowly stirred to life, though the shadows cast by last night's grim events lingered palpably. The quiet hum of daily routines carried on outside. Yet within the walls of St. Mary Mead, the undercurrent of suspicion and unease had not abated. Miss Marple sat with her knitting basket on her lap, fingers idly twisting wool as her mind worked steadily through the tangled threads of the mystery. She had spent a restless night reviewing every detail: the wobbly piano stool, the hidden note beneath the Chopin nocturne, the faded photograph discovered in the gardener's shed, and the cryptic message that hinted at a troubled past returning with the music. Now, with the dawn, the villagers' varying accounts and reactions from last evening's gathering settled more clearly into focus. Her visitor for the morning arrived promptly. Inspector Cray, bearing a file thick with his preliminary reports and statements from the witnesses. He looked grave but determined. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I hope I'm not interrupting your thoughts." "Not at all, Inspector. I was just pondering the significance of what we've learned," she replied, gesturing to the documents. "May I see your notes?" Together, they spread the papers across the small table. The statements painted a rich mosaic of motives and opportunities. Clara Goodwin's unease was evident in her hurried confession of overheard whispers about Miss Green's London past. Judith Prentice's observation about late-night phone calls hinted at hidden dealings, and Richard Goodwin's insistence that his business call was unrelated seemed increasingly fragile in the light of his wife's guarded expression. "Have you had a chance to follow up on the origins of that photograph?" Miss Marple asked. Cray nodded. "We traced the date on the back to a charity concert held 5 years ago in London. The man next to Miss Green appears to be a Mr. Lawrence Hadley, a violinist with a reputation for stirring controversy in the music world." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "A scandalous musician and a housekeeper with a secret past. Perhaps the music that played after the murder is more than metaphorical." The inspector glanced up. "We've spoken to Mr. Hadley. He denies any recent contact with Miss Green, but there's something peculiar. His alibi for the night of the recital is weak, and he was seen near St. Mary Mead the day before the murder." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "This certainly complicates matters. Yet we must remember the killer might not be an outsider. The personal tensions here in the village are too ripe." They agreed to visit the Goodwin household together, a logical next step to observe the household dynamics and question the couple further. Upon arrival, Clara greeted them with a forced smile, eyes flickering nervously between her husband and the visitors. Miss Marple took note of the delicate tension in the air, the subtle ways the couple avoided direct eye contact. As they were seated, the housekeeper, Mrs. Ellis, bustled in with tea, offering a brief but revealing glimpse of her loyalty and perhaps her own anxieties. "Mrs. Ellis, did you notice anything unusual the evening before Miss Green's death?" Miss Marple asked gently. The older woman hesitated, then admitted, "Well, miss, I did see Mr. Richard pacing in the garden after dinner, looking quite troubled. He usually enjoys a quiet evening, so it was odd." "And did you hear anything?" Cray pressed. "No, not a sound." "But he seemed restless." Miss Marple folded her hands. Restlessness can signal many things: worry, guilt, fear. It's a subtle symptom worth remembering. Richard cleared his throat. I admit I was unsettled, but only because of pressing matters at work. My wife and I had disagreements that evening, nothing more. Clara shifted uncomfortably. That's true. Richard can be intense. The inspector raised an eyebrow, but withheld comment. Miss Marple, however, silently catalogued every nuance, every glance and gesture. Later, in a quiet moment, she spoke to Clara alone. Mrs. Goodwin, I understand this is difficult, but your cooperation is vital. What exactly were these disagreements? Clara looked down. Richard wants to sell the family estate, but I feel there are things here worth preserving. We argued, yes, but it was nothing serious. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Sometimes the most trivial disputes hide deeper divides. The day unfolded with more interviews and observations. Miss Marple paid particular attention to Judith Prentice's reaction when asked about Miss Green's phone calls. The older woman's face tightened, betraying a flicker of discomfort. When gently pressed, she revealed that Miss Green had confided fears about an old acquaintance, someone who might want to reclaim something she possessed. And did she say who this person was? Miss Marple inquired. No names, just a warning to be cautious. This shadow of threat, combined with the photograph and cryptic notes, suggested that the murder was not a crime of passion, but a calculated act tied to a concealed past. That evening, back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her thoughts drifting back to the recital and the music that had accompanied the tragedy. The pieces were falling into place, but one key element eluded her: the significance of the piano stool's instability and the music sheet's positioning. As the clock chimed, a sudden memory struck her, something she had overheard at the gathering, a brief mention by Colonel Denby about a missing rehearsal on the night before the recital. She made a note to visit the Colonel the next day. The Colonel, a man of routine and pride, might unknowingly hold a vital clue. Miss Marple's keen eyes had noticed the pattern. A past intertwined with the present, lies cloaked in genteel manners, and a murderer who played their part with chilling precision. The village of St. Mary Mead was no longer the peaceful place it seemed. Beneath the calm surface, the music played on, haunting, elusive, waiting to reveal the deadly secret it concealed. The following morning dawned cool and grey, the kind of day that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for some invisible signal to break the uneasy silence that had settled over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, with her customary punctuality, arrived at Colonel Denby's modest home, a neatly kept cottage just a short walk from the village green. The Colonel, a man known for his precise habits and measured speech, greeted her with a courteous nod, though the lines etched around his eyes suggested a man weathered by more than just age. Miss Marple, he said, ushering her inside. To what do I owe this early visit? I trust you are not here to stir up more trouble. She smiled gently. On the contrary, Colonel. I was hoping to speak with you about the recital and, in particular, the rehearsal that, I understand, did not take place as planned the night before. The Colonel's jaw tightened subtly. Yes, the rehearsal was cancelled. Mrs. Green was indisposed, or so I was told. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Did you notice anything unusual about her behaviour in the days leading up to the recital? Dee hesitated. She was tense, yes, but she did not confide in me. She was a private woman. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. Did you hear her mention anyone she feared or mistrusted? The Colonel glanced away briefly. There were rumours among the musicians. A Mr. Hadley, a violinist from London with a reputation for trouble. I gather Miss Green knew him from years ago. And did she say why their acquaintance might be cause for concern? No, but Mr. Hadley's presence near the village around that time was unexpected. It disturbed some of us. Miss Marple tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. Thank you, Colonel. One last question. Did you notice anything about the piano stool or the music sheets before the recital? He frowned. Now that you mention it, the stool seemed unstable. I thought nothing of it at the time, but it did catch my eye. Interesting, Miss Marple mused. Thank you for your candour. As she left, the Colonel's parting glance suggested unease, as if a heavy burden weighed on his conscience. Walking back through the village, Miss Marple considered the Colonel's words alongside the growing tapestry of secrets she had begun to unravel. The absence of rehearsal, the threatened return of an old acquaintance, the precarious piano stool, all pointed to a carefully orchestrated plan. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple found Inspector Cray waiting with news. We've been through the Goodwins again. Their story about disagreement seems plausible, but their evasiveness bothers me. She nodded. Guilt can breed silence, Inspector. Sometimes it's not what is said, but what is left unsaid that matters.
Also, Mrs. Ellis mentioned seeing Mr. Goodwin pacing in the garden the night of the murder, Cray added. We've checked his phone records. There was a call from an unknown number shortly before the recital. Miss Marple's eyes lit
with interest. A call from an unknown number? And did Mr. Goodwin receive any messages or notes recently? Nothing reported yet. But we found a receipt in his jacket pocket from a pawn shop in London, dated 2 days ago. Miss Marple pursed her lips. London again. There's a thread running through this town that leads to the city, and to shadows Miss Green hoped to leave behind. Cray sighed. It's as if everyone here has something to hide. Miss Marple smiled gently. Exactly, Inspector. And it is my job to find out what. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple visited the village post office and the small market, discreetly listening to gossip and carefully observing the villagers' behaviour. The weight of eyes followed her, curious but wary. She caught snippets of conversation, whispers of old scandals, jealousies and regrets that lurked beneath the village's genteel surface. Later, at the local inn, she met with Judith Prentice once more. Judith's composure seemed to falter under Miss Marple's gentle questioning. Miss Prentice, she began, you mentioned Miss Green made late-night calls and spoke of fears. Do you know who these calls were to? Judith hesitated, then nodded. To a man named Philip, a friend from her past, I believe. Did she say why she feared him? Not directly, but Philip had a reputation, troublesome business in London, and a temper to match. Miss Green feared that if he found her here, the past might catch up with her. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Did Philip know about the photograph? Judith looked down. I think so. Miss Green showed it to me once, warning me to be careful. She feared that the secrets in it could destroy lives. Thank you, Judith. That helps clarify much. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her mind turning over the day's discoveries. The network of relationships, the Goodwin's strain, Judith's warnings, Colonel Denby's unease, and the ominous figure of Philip were pieces of a complex puzzle. Her thoughts returned to the piano, to the notion that the music was a smokescreen, a melody masking darker motives. She recalled the mysterious note. The past returns with the music. It was not merely poetic, it was a warning. Miss Marple understood that the murderer was someone intimately familiar with the house, the recital, and Miss Green's history. Someone capable of using subtle distractions like the unstable stool and the timing of the music to conceal their deadly intent. Tomorrow promised further revelations, and she intended to be ready. For in St. Mary Mead, beneath the peaceful surface, the music was far from over, and its final movement was approaching. The morning air was crisp as Miss Marple made her way to the village post office. her mind busily assembling fragments from the past day's inquiries. The quiet bustle of St. Mary Mead's residents went about their daily tasks, yet beneath the routine lay a nervous energy, like a taut string waiting to snap. Miss Marple sensed it in the furtive glances and whispered conversations that faded when she approached. Inside the modest post office, the elderly postmistress, Mrs. Harper, greeted her with a soft smile. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Here about the letters, are you?" "Yes, Mrs. Harper," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair. "I understand that Miss Green received some correspondence shortly before the recital. Would you recall anything unusual about the mail she received recently?" Mrs. Harper nodded slowly, fingers fiddling with a thread on her apron. "Yes, there was a letter that came from London, sent a few days before the event. Miss Green seemed quite troubled when she read it. She left it on the counter and hurried away. I never saw her open it." "That's very helpful," Miss Marple said gently. "Did the letter have a return address or any identifying marks?" Mrs. Harper thought for a moment. "No return address, but the handwriting was rather elegant, rather old-fashioned. The postmark was smudged, but I believe it was from a district in London known as Bloomsbury." Miss Marple's mind immediately connected the dots. London, Bloomsbury, Philip, the mysterious man Judith Prentice had mentioned. The past was indeed threading itself through the present in a dangerous way. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper. If you happen to find anything else unusual, do let me know," Miss Marple said kindly as she rose to leave. Her next stop was the village market, where she hoped to gather impressions from other villagers, especially those who had been at the recital. The market was alive with familiar faces, shopkeepers, farmers, and housewives, all eager to exchange news, though some glanced warily at Miss Marple's calm presence. She approached Mrs. Lydia Barker, the florist, who had been one of the first to arrive at the scene after the murder. "Mrs. Barker, might I trouble you for your observations on that night?" Miss Marple inquired, setting her voice to its softest, most unobtrusive tone. "Mrs." Barker clasped her hands nervously. "Well, Miss Marple, it was dreadful, truly. I did hear something odd, though. Just before the music started, I thought I heard a muffled argument in the back hall, near the servants' quarters. I couldn't make out the words, but it didn't sound friendly." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "An argument, you say? Between whom?" "I don't know, I'm afraid. But afterwards I saw Mr. Goodwin looking very flustered and hurried away from the house." This was the first time Richard Goodwin's behavior was linked to a potential conflict. Miss Marple filed this quietly away. It could be a piece of the puzzle or simply a misinterpreted moment of tension. As the day wore on, Miss Marple found herself returning to the village hall, where she knew the piano was still held under guard. The sight of it brought to mind the unstable stool and the peculiar position of the music sheets. Carefully she examined the stool, noting the slight unevenness of one leg and the scuff marks on the floor where it had been dragged. Her fingers traced the edges of the Chopin nocturne, now slightly curled. She recalled that the music had been interrupted, stopped abruptly after just a few bars. Why had the recital stopped? Had the killer intended the music to cover some other sound or to create a distraction at the precise moment? Her questions remained unanswered as Inspector Cray approached, his face drawn. "Miss Marple, there's been a development," he said quietly. "We've received word that a letter, matching the description you obtained from Mrs. Harper, was found hidden in the lining of Miss Green's coat." Miss Marple took the envelope with steady hands. Inside was a letter, typed on delicate stationery but unsigned. It warned Miss Green that the past you thought buried is closer than you. No, leave St. Mary Mead before the music ends or suffer the consequences. The message was chilling, yet devoid of any direct threat. "This confirms what Judith and others suspected," Miss Marple said. "Someone wanted Miss Green gone and was willing to act when she refused." Inspector Cray frowned. "We've also checked the pawnshop receipt found on Mr. Goodwin. It corresponds to a silver locket, but it's unclear who pawned it or why. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. A locket, you say? Jewelry often carries memories and secrets, sometimes more valuable than gold. Later that evening, the village hall was quieter than usual. Miss Marple took a moment to sit at the piano, her hands hovering just above the keys. She played a few soft notes, the melancholic melody of the Chopin nocturne filling the room. The music's fragility echoed the delicate balance of the village's social fabric, a harmony easily shattered. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Judith Prentice entered hesitantly, her expression troubled. "Miss Marple, I thought you might want to know," she began, voice trembling slightly. "Philip. He's arrived in the village. I saw him this afternoon lurking near the post office." Miss Marple's heart quickened. The man from Miss Green's past had come closer, the threat now tangible and immediate. "Thank you, Judith. This changes everything." As Judith left, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the piano. The music had stopped, but the true crescendo was yet to come. The murderer was still at large, weaving deception with every note, and Miss Marple was determined to unmask them before the final chord was struck. The following morning dawned with a delicate mist that clung softly to the hedgerows and the thatched roofs of St. Mary Mead, as if nature itself sought to veil the uneasy tension hanging over the village. Miss Marple, wrapped in her usual tweed coat, took her time crossing the village green, thoughts swirling like the mist around her. Philip's arrival was a new variable, one that sharpened the already tangled web of secrets and suspicions. Her first call was to the vicarage, a place she often found a quiet refuge and a wellspring of local knowledge. The Reverend Jonathan Clark received her warmly, his kindly eyes shadowed with concern. "Miss Marple," he said, "these are difficult days for us all. I gather Philip has unsettled the village." "Yes, Reverend. He seems to be stirring old embers, and not in a benign way." Miss Marple glanced at the vicar's modest sitting room, noting a half-finished crossword puzzle on the table. "Have you noticed anything unusual since his arrival?" The vicar sighed. "There have been whispered conversations in the vestry, hushed warnings. People are afraid, and some old grievances are bubbling to the surface. It's as if a long-dormant fault line has cracked open." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Do you know where Philip is lodging?" "Ah, yes," the vicar replied, "at the Rosewood Inn, though he keeps mostly to himself." Before leaving, Miss Marple took a moment to scan the vicar's bookcase. A leather-bound volume of village history caught her eye, the edges worn and well-thumbed. She made a mental note to revisit it. The past often held the key to present troubles. The Rosewood Inn was a modest establishment with ivy climbing its weathered stone walls. Miss Marple arrived mid-morning, observing the innkeeper's wary glance as she inquired after Philip. The man's answer was curt, but he eventually admitted that Philip was seen in the common room, speaking with a stranger. With polite determination, Miss Marple entered the dimly lit common room. The low murmur of voices fell away as heads turned toward her. Near the hearth sat Philip, tall and pale, his dark eyes flickering with a restless energy. Opposite him was a man Miss Marple recognized from the village, Mr. Goodwin, whose pallor and nervous glance betrayed his unease. The two men appeared to be in a heated discussion, but at Miss Marple's approach, they ceased talking, exchanging wary looks. "Mr. Philip," Miss Marple greeted him gently, "I trust the village has been kind to you." Philip's gaze flickered briefly, revealing a trace of something like defiance. "Miss Marple, I came here because the past cannot stay buried forever. Judith Green and others have stories to answer for, stories that affect more than just this quiet village." "And you believe justice can be found here?" Miss Marple asked, folding her hands calmly. Philip shrugged. "Perhaps. Or revenge." Mr. Goodwin shifted uneasily. This is nonsense. We are all good, respectable people here. No one wants trouble. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Is that so, Richard? And yet you were seen leaving the recital house in a hurry the night of the murder. Goodwin swallowed. I was upset, yes, but not responsible for what happened. Philip interjected, voice cold. We all have secrets, Mr. Goodwin, some darker than others. Miss Marple detected the flicker of fear in Goodwin's eyes and the barely concealed menace in Philip's tone. The interplay of old wounds and new threats was laying bare the fault lines beneath St. Mary Mead's polished surface. After leaving the inn, Miss Marple wandered toward the village library, seeking solace in its orderly shelves and the quiet companionship of books. She hoped the librarian, Miss Edith Langley, might have observed something unusual. Edith, a prim woman with a keen eye, greeted her with a tight smile. Miss Marple, I heard the news about Philip. People are talking, but few dare say much openly. Did you notice anything odd about his visit here? Miss Marple asked. Only that he seemed particularly interested in the village archives, Edith replied. Old newspapers, census records and the like. He asked about the Green family history extensively. That confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion that Philip was digging deeper, perhaps seeking something to support his vendetta or vindication. As she stepped back outside, a soft voice called her name. Turning, Miss Marple saw Judith approaching, her face pale but resolute. I had to tell you, Judith said breathlessly. Philip and Richard Goodwin argued fiercely this morning. I overheard it near the market. Philip accused Goodwin of hiding something related to the night of the murder. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled ever so slightly. Indeed, secrets are a dangerous burden. Judith hesitated, then added, Also, Mrs. Harper mentioned that the letter Miss Green received might not be the only one. There's talk that more. Threats were sent, but no one knows from whom. The plot thickened. Miss Marple pondered the significance of multiple anonymous letters. Someone was orchestrating fear. But why? Later that day, the police station buzzed with news that deepened. The mystery. A second crime had occurred. Mr. Alfred Jennings, a respected farmer and close friend to the Green family, had been found unconscious near his fields, the victim of a violent assault. Inspector Cray was quick to share the details with Miss Marple. We believe the attack was meant to intimidate. Jennings had recently clashed with Philip over land boundaries, but it may also be connected to the Green matter. Miss Marple considered the tangled relationships. It seems the unrest has begun to spill beyond words. Indeed, the village's veneer of tranquility was cracking, and the ripples from the murder were far-reaching. As dusk settled, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. She sat by the fire, sifting through her mental notes like a gardener sorting seeds before planting. The silent music of the Chopin nocturne still haunted her thoughts. The interrupted melody now seemed a metaphor for the lives unsettled by jealousy, fear, and long-held grudges. Her mind circled back to the locket, a small piece of jewelry, yet heavy with meaning. Who had owned it? And why had it been pawned? She recalled the moment at the recital when she had noticed a faint scent of lavender lingering on the piano stool. It was subtle, yet out of place in a room filled with polished wood and old leather. Lavender was a popular scent, but in a small village, it could point to someone particular. Miss Marple resolved to revisit Mrs. Barker's flower shop the next morning, hoping the florist might shed light on that delicate fragrance. In the silence of the evening, Miss Marple allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She knew the true test was approaching, uncovering the intricate dance of motives and opportunities with patience and a keen eye. The music that played after the murder was far from over, and in that lingering melody, the murderer was hiding, their final note. Miss Marple was ready to listen. The morning sun cast a gentle light across the village of St. Mary Mead, yet beneath the quaint facades and blooming gardens, a palpable tension lingered. like a faint but persistent undercurrent. Beneath a calm sea, Miss Marple stepped out of her cottage with a sense of quiet purpose. The conversations and revelations of the previous days had provided threads, but the tapestry of the mystery was far from complete. Today, she would begin to weave those threads into something more coherent. Her first destination was Mrs. Barker's flower shop, a small, fragrant haven nestled between the bakery and the post office. The shop was alive with the subtle scents of roses, lilies, and, of course, lavender. Mrs. Barker herself was tending to a fresh batch of violets when Miss Marple arrived, her fingers deftly arranging blossoms into a bouquet. "Good morning, Mrs. Barker," Miss Marple greeted, stepping inside. The floral scents mingled with the faint trace of the lavender she had noted at the recital. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Barker responded with a warm smile. "I was just preparing some bouquets for the church service." Miss Marple allowed her gaze to wander over the neat rows of flowers before asking casually, "I wonder if you might help me with something. I noticed a subtle scent of lavender lingering at the recital hall, almost out of place." Mrs. Barker's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. "Lavender, you say? Well, it's quite a popular scent for sachets and potpourri, but only a few villagers buy lavender specifically. Do you keep records of your customers?" Miss Marple inquired. "Perhaps someone frequently purchases lavender, which might explain the scent." Mrs. Barker nodded. "Yes, I keep a ledger for special orders. Let me see." She pulled a small, worn book from beneath the counter and flipped through the pages. "Ah, here we are. Recently, Miss Elaine Green bought lavender oil and dried sprigs. She often favoured that scent as it reminded her of her mother's garden." Miss Marple felt a quiet pang. Elaine Green, judging by the villagers' accounts, a young woman still mourning the loss of her sister Judith. "Thank you, Mrs. Barker, that is helpful." As she left the shop, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Elaine. Was the lavender scent at the recital a lingering trace of her presence? Could it have been a clue or merely an innocent detail? Next, she made her way to the village hall, where the townsfolk had gathered for a meeting called by Inspector Cray. The mood was restless, the murmur of voices carrying grievances and suspicions. Inspector Cray stood at the front, his usual composed demeanour strained. "The attack on Mr. Jennings has unsettled us all," he addressed the crowd. "I assure you, we are pursuing all leads, but I must ask for your cooperation and patience." Among the villagers, several faces turned towards Miss Marple as she took a seat near the back. Mrs. Cleary, the postmistress, leaned in to whisper, "There's talk that Philip's accusations have stirred up old rivalries. Some say the Green family's troubles are deeper than we knew." Miss Marple nodded subtly, her eyes scanning the room. The same faces she had observed before, each harbouring secrets and silent motives. After the meeting, Miss Marple sought out Judith Green. She found her sitting alone on a bench outside the hall, eyes distant and troubled. "Judith," Miss Marple began gently, "how are you coping with everything?" Judith looked up, her face pale but determined. "It's difficult, Miss Marple. Philip's return has reopened wounds I thought were healing. I don't know what he truly wants, but I fear the village is fracturing under the strain." "Has Philip spoken to you directly since his arrival?" "Only briefly," Judith admitted. "He insists that the truth about Judith's death has been hidden. He believes someone in this village is responsible." Miss Marple considered this. Truth can be a heavy burden, and sometimes it takes time to reveal itself fully. As Judith rose to leave, Miss Marple's gaze caught the glint of a familiar locket resting against her chest, an item that had surfaced repeatedly in her thoughts. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the village archives, where she pored over old newspapers and records. Her fingers traced headlines from decades past, noting mentions of disputes over land, broken engagements, and social scandals that, while long buried, could still influence the present. One article, dated nearly 30 years ago, caught her attention, a story about a tragic accident involving the Green family estate, a fire that claimed a life and left behind whispers of negligence and resentment. The article mentioned a mysterious visitor who had threatened legal action but disappeared without a trace. Miss Marple's mind connected this forgotten incident to the current tensions. Could the roots of the murder extend far beyond a single night? As evening approached, she returned to her cottage where the familiar comfort of her well-worn armchair awaited. She reviewed her notes, careful to avoid drawing premature conclusions. The delicate interplay of characters, Philip's relentless pursuit, Goodwin's unease, Judith's grief, and the shadow of old village secrets, formed a complex puzzle. Just as she was preparing to rest, there was a soft knock at her door. Opening it, she found Mr. Goodwin standing hesitantly, his usual composure replaced by a nervous edge. "Miss Marple, may I come in?" "I wish to speak with you." Curiosity piqued, she invited him inside. Once seated, Goodwin took a deep breath. "There's something I haven't told the inspector," he began. "Something I should have said before. It concerns the night of the recital." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Go on, Richard." He glanced around as if wary of unseen ears. "I saw someone near the back exit of the hall just after the music ended. A figure I didn't recognize, cloaked and moving quickly. I didn't think to mention it earlier because I wasn't sure, but now I believe that person may be involved in what happened." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. A stranger in St. Mary Mead, at such a late hour. That would be unusual indeed. "Yes," Goodwin agreed, his voice low. "I fear this mystery is deeper than any of us imagined." As Goodwin departed, Miss Marple stood by the window, watching the twilight deepen over the village. The unseen figure, the old grievances, the cryptic letters, and now a possible stranger, all these threads were weaving tighter. The music that played after the murder was no longer just a broken melody. It was a symphony of hidden motives, whispered threats, and shadowed pasts. And Miss Marple knew that soon the final note would be struck. But to hear it clearly, she would need patience, sharp observation, and the quiet cunning that had long been her greatest strength. The dawn of a crisp autumn morning brought a fragile calm to St. Mary Mead, though the village seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next act in a play that none wished to star in. Miss Marple sat by her window, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her teacup as she contemplated the night's revelations. Richard Goodwin's account of the shadowy figure near the back exit of the hall had added a new layer of complexity to a case already dense with secrets. She knew that this unknown presence could be the key to unraveling the tangled web, yet the question remained, who could they be, and why had they come? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock. Standing just beyond the threshold was the village constable, young Tom Ellis, his face pale and serious. "Miss Marple, there's been another development," he said, stepping inside. "The inspector has requested your presence at the village hall. There's something he wants you to see." Miss Marple nodded, rising with her usual quiet grace. "Lead the way, Tom." The village hall was alive with an uneasy energy. A handful of villagers gathered near the entrance, whispers darting like shadows across the polished floor. Inspector Cray stood by a wooden table, upon which lay a folded piece of fabric, stained and crumpled. "This," Cray began, "was found caught on the thorn bush beside the back exit of the hall." He unfolded the cloth to reveal a delicate handkerchief, embroidered with an intricate pattern of violets and leaves. Miss Marple examined the handkerchief carefully. "The embroidery is quite fine," she observed. "This is not a common design in St. Mary Mead." "I asked Mrs. Barker," Cray continued. "She recognizes it as part of a set sold only to a few customers, including Miss Elaine Green." Murmur swept through the crowd. Elaine, who had remained mostly silent since the events unfolded, stepped forward, her eyes wide with alarm. I don't know how it got there," she stammered. "It must have fallen from my bag during the recital." Miss Marple studied Elaine's expression, noting the flicker of genuine surprise mixed with something else, a guarded tension. "Do you remember if anyone might have been near you at the time?" she inquired softly. Elaine hesitated. "There were many people. I'm afraid I didn't notice." Inspector Cray turned to the villagers. "We must consider that the person who left this handkerchief might be the same shadow Goodwin saw. If so, this could be the breakthrough we need." Miss Marple's mind raced. The handkerchief was a tangible clue, but also a potential red herring. Was it deliberately left to implicate Elaine, or an accidental token lost in a moment of haste? Later. That day, Miss Marple arranged to meet with Philip Jennings at the Red Lion Inn, where the atmosphere was thick with gossip and half-spoken accusations. Philip sat in a corner booth, his expression a mixture of frustration and resolve. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, "I hear you've been uncovering some curious details." "I have," she replied, "but I'm still trying to understand the full picture. Your arrival stirred many emotions here." Philip nodded. "That was my intention, to find justice for my sister." "And do you believe Elaine Green to be involved?" He frowned. "It's hard to say. She and Judith were close, yet their relationship was complicated. Elaine was often overshadowed by Judith's charm." Miss Marple sipped her tea, choosing her words with care. Sometimes the bonds of friendship conceal resentments and secrets that only emerge under pressure. Philip looked up sharply. "Are you suggesting Elaine could be responsible?" "Not at all," Miss Marple replied gently. "But she, like others, bears a history that might offer insights if we look closely." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Judith Green, her eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights. She took a seat beside Philip, and for a moment the three shared a silence laden with unspoken grief. Judith finally spoke. "I found something yesterday." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, worn and yellowed. It was tucked inside one of Judith's old books. Miss Marple leaned forward, curiosity piqued. The envelope was sealed with a faded wax crest, the initials R.G. "Do you know who this might belong to?" she asked. Judith shook her head. "I asked around, but no one recognizes the seal." With careful fingers, Miss Marple broke the seal and withdrew a folded letter. The handwriting was elegant, the ink faded, but legible. "My dearest Judith, if ever you read this, know that I am sorry for the pain my actions have caused. I could not bear the thought of our family's disgrace falling upon your shoulders. The truth is heavier than you can imagine, and though I tried to protect you, it seems fate has not been kind. Trust no one, and be wary of the music that plays in the shadows. R.G." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "R.G., these initials might hold the key to more than one secret." Judith's gaze was steady. "Do you think this is connected to the fire years ago?" "It seems likely," Miss Marple said softly. "And the warning about the music suggests there are dangers still hidden beneath the surface." That evening, Miss Marple found herself back at the recital hall, the scene of the first crime, and the place where the mystery had begun to unravel. The hall was deserted, shadows stretching across the polished floor like silent sentinels. She approached the grand piano, its glossy black surface reflecting the flickering light. Memories of the haunting melody that had accompanied the murder played in her mind. Her fingers brushed lightly over the keys, and a faint note lingered in the air, echoing the warning in the letter. Suddenly, a sound startled her. Footsteps, deliberate and slow, approached from the entrance. Miss Marple turned to see Philip Jennings standing in the doorway, his face pale. "I couldn't stay away," he admitted. "I needed to hear the music again to understand." Miss Marple nodded. The music seems to be more than mere notes. It's a language of secrets. Philip's eyes searched hers. Do you think the killer might strike again? Perhaps, she answered. But the truth, once uncovered, can silence even the darkest of melodies. As the night deepened, the village of St. Mary Mead remained shrouded in mystery, its peaceful veneer cracked to reveal the complex harmonies of human nature, where love and jealousy, grief and guilt played on unseen strings. Miss Marple, ever watchful, knew that soon the final movement would begin, and with it, the resolution that had eluded them all. But for now, she would listen closely to every note, every whisper, until the music that played after the murder revealed its final secret. The chill of the early evening wrapped itself gently around St. Mary Mead as Miss Marple made her way toward the village hall once more. The gathering had been called, an invitation extended by Inspector Cray to all those involved, though it was widely understood that the evening's purpose was far more solemn than social. Miss Marple's keen eyes scanned the familiar faces clustered beneath the dim glow of the chandeliers, each expression a tapestry of tension, curiosity, and concealed dread. Richard Goodwin stood by the window, his usually confident posture subdued, while Elaine Green sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Philip Jennings remained near the back, his gaze fixed on the polished floor, and Judith Green, pale but resolute, held her mother's hand with a quiet strength. The inspector took a deep breath and motioned for silence. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "Tonight we hope to bring some clarity to the tragedy that has cast its shadow over our village." Miss Marple stepped forward, her demeanor composed yet radiating a gentle authority. "There is much to consider," she said softly, "but I believe the tangled threads of this mystery are ready to be drawn together." She paused, allowing the room's attention to settle fully upon her before continuing. It began, as many tragedies do, with a web of old grievances and unspoken truths. Judith's fire years ago was no accident, but a desperate attempt to conceal a family secret, a secret tied closely to the initials RG, which stand for Rupert Green, Judith's late uncle. Rupert was a man whose actions left scars deeper than any flame could burn. His debts, his entanglements, and the disgrace he sought to hide created ripples that are only now reaching shore. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Elaine Green. "Elaine, your handkerchief was found near the scene, but its presence was not proof of guilt. Instead, it was a clue left unwittingly, a fragment of your nervousness and misplaced haste." Turning to Richard Goodwin, she said, "And you, Richard, your eagerness to protect your family clouded your judgment. You suspected Elaine because she was an outsider to your circle, yet you overlooked the subtle signs closer to home." The room stirred slightly. Breaths held as Miss Marple's eyes settled on Philip Jennings. "Philip, your arrival reopened old wounds. You came seeking justice for your sister, but your anger blinded you to the truth. The killer was one who lived among you, weaving deceit like a skilled musician composing a deadly melody." She stepped closer to the piano, fingers tracing the worn keys. The music that played after the murder was a message, a final act of desperation by the true culprit. The melody was not random. It was a signal only they could understand. Turning to Judith, Miss Marple smiled gently. "Judith, you have carried a heavy burden. You hid the letter from Rupert Green, fearing what the truth might unleash. But the letter was also a warning about trust, betrayal, and the dangers lurking beneath friendly smiles." The room fell silent, heavy with anticipation. "The murderer," Miss Marple said quietly but firmly, "is none other than Mrs. Barker, our village hall's caretaker." Gasps and shocked murmurs filled the room. "Mrs. Barker," Miss Marple explained, "has lived here long enough to know the secrets of every family. She resented Rupert Green's influence over the village and Judith's family, believing it brought ruin to her own kin. On the night of the recital, when Judith confronted her about stolen funds meant for hall repairs, Mrs. Barker panicked. The struggle ensued, and in a moment of rage, she committed murder. The inspector stepped forward, signaling officers to approach. Furthermore, Miss Marple continued, the shadow seen by Richard was Mrs. Barker trying to escape unnoticed. The handkerchief belonged to Elaine, dropped inadvertently during the chaos. The music, the haunting melody, was played by Mrs. Barker herself, a macabre confession to the guilt that gnawed at her. As officers led Mrs. Barker away, the weight of revelation settled over the village. Elaine breathed freely for the first time in days. Philip's eyes reflected a complex blend of relief and sorrow, and Judith's shoulders relaxed. The truth no longer a solitary burden. Miss Marple, ever. Serene gathered her shawl and prepared to leave. As she stepped outside into the cool night air, she glanced back at the hall. In every heart lies a hidden story, she mused quietly to herself, and sometimes it takes the quietest observer to hear the music playing beneath the noise. The village of St. Mary Mead, scarred but healing, would remember this autumn for years to come. But for Miss Marple, the rhythm of human nature, its sorrows and secrets, remained as familiar and inscrutable as ever.